Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to King's. My name is Nicholas Marston. I'm the Vice Provost, and I'm speaking to you from the Old Lodge in King's, just along the way from the Provost's study. It's very good to have you with us for this session in which three of my colleagues are going to talk about their current research within the college community. There's been a slight change of personnel since the event was first advertised on the website. Marwa Mahmood is unfortunately indisposed, and I'm very grateful to Caroline Goodson, who has stepped in to fill her place. And Caroline will be talking to us about urban gardening in early medieval Italy, which sits somewhere between improvised comedy and banking bad. This is online. The way that the session will operate is that each speaker will have up to 15 minutes to present their research, and then during the last 15 minutes we'll pose questions which have been placed by you, which you can add to the chat or the question and answer function on Zoom as things are going along. You, as the audience, can see and hear me, I hope, and the speakers, but you will have your microphones and cameras switched off automatically so that at no point can you be seen or heard by anyone in the webinar. But of course, you can still communicate with us in the way that I've just described. If you have a question for a specific speaker, or indeed for more than one speaker, make clear at the outset to whom your question is directed, and we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. The event is being recorded, and we'll post the recording to our website over the next few days. So I hope that that's all the time that I need to take up in introducing this event. And so what I'd like to do now is to hand over immediately to Professor Jason Sharman, who is going to address us on the topic of banking bad, mystery shopping for anonymous access to the global financial system. Jason, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Provost. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen for the PowerPoint presentation. I'm interested in a class of financial crimes to do with the use, or rather the misuse, of banks and shell companies. And this is oriented around a basic question of simple to state, hard to answer. And this is whether the rules designed to keep criminal money out of the global financial system actually work, or perhaps restated as how well or how badly do those rules designed to keep dirty money out of the global financial system work. I should say at the outset, this is part of a co-authored project with Mike Finley and Dan Nielsen. It's been going on for 10 years, so pretty long running, and obviously I'll just present a sample of what we've been doing. We're particularly interested in a related class of financial crimes, cross-border financial crimes, large-scale ones, things like money laundering, corruption, tax evasion, sanctions busting, and the financing of terrorism. And we think what's distinctive about the study is that we attempt to judge the effectiveness of rules by trying to break them and seeing what happens. And the intuition is that if you can break rules easily without attracting punishment or sanction, the rules are not terribly effective. Conversely, if it's difficult to break the rules, or if in doing so you get punished, then prima facie we have some evidence to say that they're effective. Just for the remainder of the brief presentation, first off, a few remarks about the nature of the problem and the global rules in question. Secondly, a bit more about the logic and design of our study, this rule testing by rule breaking strategy. And thirdly, some of the findings that we've got so far. So a pretty close link between money and crime. Most, but not all, crime is motivated by profit, particularly if we're talking about organized crime or cross-border crime. It's almost always motivated by profit. And if we're talking about banks, talking about money rather, and moving money across borders, banks are the key gatekeepers. There are different ways you can move money across borders: cash and suitcases, cryptocurrency, but really it is banks and wire transfers that are the, as I say, the key locus of compliance there. Banks have been involved in a cavalcade of financial scandals, and their complicity kind of ranges. Sometimes they're active co-conspirators with the tax evaders or money launderers. Sometimes, however, they're unwitting victims. They're pretty ignorant of the dirty money being passed through their systems. But there's also an intermediate spectrum as well, where the banks can be reckless or negligent, where they can be willfully blind in not asking questions they should be asking. If the link between banks and financial crime is pretty clear, perhaps the link between shell companies and financial crime is a little less clear. If you're a criminal, I guess the key line that you want to be able to say convincingly is, "It wasn't me." And the advantage of shell companies is that they act to separate, screen, and conceal financial misbehavior, financial crime. How is a shell company different from any other sort of company? Shell companies have no real business purpose. They don't produce a good or a service. Instead, they're just kind of a legal entity, a legal person, but valuable for that same reason in that as legal persons, they can own property, but also can hold bank accounts. You can have a corporate account, of course, in the name of the company, as well as in the name of the individual. And it's that combination of bank accounts held by shell companies that's probably the number one mechanism for commissioning those various sorts of cross-border financial crimes that I mentioned. You talk about many examples of this, but perhaps one that's been in the news of late is the so-called Mdb Scandal in Malaysia, where about $4.5 billion was siphoned off from Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund with the compliance of the Prime Minister at the time, and one that crucially involves banks and shell companies. We can kind of see here two gentlemen, and probably the one on the left is pretty recognizable as Leonardo DiCaprio, famous actor. The one on the right, perhaps less well known, Joe Low, currently a fugitive from the law, suspected of being in China. And Joe Low masterminded this process of siphoning off $4.5 billion through banks and through shell companies. The link between the two, and the art imitates life, is one of the things that Joe Low used. A portion of this $4.5 billion was actually financing the film The Wolf of Wall Street. And so here we have a film about financial crime and money laundering that's actually financed by financial crime and money laundering. And indeed, the US Justice Department has confiscated the $60 million profit of the film as indeed the profits of crime. Okay, so if we've got this class of crime, as I say, one Mdb is one scandal amongst many, we also have a system of global rules designed to prevent it, designed to keep dirty money out of the financial system. It's extensive, it's expensive, it's complicated, but it can be summed up probably in two basic rules. The first one is the injunction for banks and other financial firms to know your customer. The second one I'll talk about a bit later, this idea of a risk-based approach. So first off, we know just commonsensically, when we go to a bank, when we open a bank account, we have to prove to the bank that we are who we say we are with reference to government-issued photo identity documents, a passport, a driver's license, something similar. The same duty applies probably even more strongly for corporations that want to open a bank account. That is, the Know Your Customer rule specifies that banks must know the true owner of corporations holding bank accounts. And I guess 48 hours ago, there was material leaked from the US Treasury Department, so-called FinCEN files, which showed a company, ABSI Enterprises, open an account with US bank JP Morgan, and indeed sent $1 billion through that bank. Unfortunately, somewhat belatedly, JP Morgan found out that ABSI Enterprises was probably owned by the most infamous mafioso in Russia, Semyon Mogilevich, who was using the shell company ABSI as a screen to transfer some of the proceeds of crime. Okay, so know your customer is rule number one. Rule number two, again, fairly intuitive if the banks and other financial institutions are meant to apply a risk-based approach. That is, simply high-risk customers should attract more scrutiny from banks, and of course, more innocuous customers warrant less scrutiny. It's this idea of there's only so much time and attention to go around, and indeed banks should spend this effort in the way that it's going to produce greatest regulatory return, most effort to keep out dirty money. Okay, intuitively we know that just because you set up a speeding limit doesn't mean that people drive any slower. just because you ban a certain class of drugs doesn't mean that class of drugs is actually unavailable. So with my co-authors, I'm not really interested in what the rules say in theory. I'm interested in what happens in practice. We decided to test this by mystery shopping. So in the 1940s, US firms used to send fake shoppers to supermarkets to see how good, bad, or indifferent the service was. Our mystery shopping, instead of going to supermarkets, is we go to banks and we go to firms that sell shell companies. And we're interested in what happens when we secretly impersonate customers and ask for things that are forbidden by global rules, namely anonymous access to the financial system. We will divide this into two parts. The first one, called Global Shell Games, we impersonate 21 fictitious consultants, just people we kind of make up profiles. And these 21 fictitious people have sent out about 7,500 solicitations, all asking for precisely the kind of untraceable or anonymous shell companies that are banned by these global rules. And again, it's a big exercise. We hit almost every country in the world in looking at 170. The second component of our mystery shopping expedition, it's illegal to lie to banks in writing. So we actually had to set up 12 real shell companies in 12 different countries. And then we made 15,000 email solicitations, pretty much to every bank in the world, asking for corporate bank accounts to see whether banks did what they should do, namely make us prove who owned the company. In all of these responses, in all of these solicitations, we could get a number of responses from banks. First off, perhaps they just don't respond at all. Secondly, banks or financial firms could refuse to do business. If they did respond, if they did agree to do business, we are interested in whether they enforced the know your customer requirement, whether they forced us to prove who we actually were. And as I say, we did this by posing a variety of high and low risk profiles, by changing the nationality of our fictitious consultants and changing the nationality of our shell companies. Okay. A bit more formally, what we did was a mystery shopping, but also a field experiment as well. How does the logic apply? We think of experiments happening in labs. Well, I guess vaccines have been much on people's minds at the moment. People are probably familiar with the idea of medical causation by randomly allocating people to control and treatment groups, control getting a placebo, the treatment group getting a drug, and at the end of the day, you measure the differences in health between control and treatment groups to test the causal effect. This same logic has been implied in social sciences as well, and perhaps one example of this is a study called Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? And this is a test of racial discrimination in the labour market, where hundreds of identical CVs were sent out to would-be employers in the United States. The CVs were identical, but for either white-sounding names, Emily and Greg, or black-sounding names, namely Lakeisha and Jamal. And because of the random allocation, the idea was that you would test how many times, how many CVs you'd have to find out before you'd get responses from employers, a callback for interviews. And very sadly, it found out that for black-sounding, even with identical CVs, for black-sounding applicants, they had to send out 50% more CVs to would-be employers to get the same response. If discrimination is bad news for Emily and Greg, then if discrimination for our purposes is good. We want to see banks discriminating between low and high risk customers, between customers hailing from, say, high corruption risk countries as opposed to low corruption risk countries. So again, in our measures of whether we get a response, whether we get a refusal, whether banks are compliant with a know your customer principle, if the system is working, we should see a pretty big difference between the companies formed in high-risk jurisdictions or the fictitious consultants from high-risk jurisdictions, those associated with corruption. Some of the places we formed, Papua New Guinea, Bangladesh, perceived rightly or wrongly as high corruption risk, Australia and New Zealand perceived rightly or wrongly as low corruption risk. Okay, so we've got this kind of gigantic mystery shopping expedition, this field experiment. What sort of things did we find? Just to finish up. When it came to shopping for shell companies, we found that in contravention of international rules, it's actually quite easy to get an untraceable shell company in violation of international rules. Only about half of the people we contacted properly applied the Know Your Customer principle, and indeed about a quarter of them did not require any proof of identity before being willing to sell us a shell company. We found that they were incredibly insensitive to risk, that it made almost no difference whether we impersonated a high-risk customer in terms of corruption or money laundering, or a low risk. And lastly, in that part of the study, somewhat surprisingly, we found out that firms in traditional tax haven jurisdictions were actually more likely to follow international rules than those based in places like Britain and the United States. For the bit where we were using shell companies to get bank accounts, we have good news and bad news. The good news is that it's quite hard to set up an anonymous bank account. If you want to get into the banking system, you do have to provide some evidence of who you are. The bad news, however, is that the risk-based approach remains largely a dead letter. The thousands of banks, it made almost no difference in terms of response, refusal, and compliance rates, whether we were a very high-risk customer or a very low-risk customer. So just to finish up, whether we're interested in the effectiveness of rules when it comes to racial discrimination or indeed financial regulation, then we can learn from the logic of the laboratory in finding out what works and what doesn't. Hopefully findings that are useful not just to scholars, but also to policymakers and citizens as well. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand over to Caroline at this point.
Thank you, Jason. If you stop sharing, yes, then I can start sharing. Let's do that. Right. Good. Okay. Hi, I'm Caroline Goodson. I'm an archaeologist and historian working on the early Middle Ages. And I'm particularly interested in cities in the early Middle Ages. I've written about Rome in the 9th century. I've written about Kairouan in what's now Tunisia. And about 10 years ago, I started trying to gather everything that we could know about cities in southern Italy in particular. And I wanted to think about Naples and Bari and Palermo in the post-Roman period, because I wondered whether they had more in common with Muslim North Africa than they had in common with the Carolingians and all of the kind of major political developments that were happening north of the Alps. And so I set about reading everything that I could, all the archaeological reports and all of the documents that we had for these cities. And I surprised myself because I kept finding gardens in these cities. It's certainly true that in villages there were kitchen gardens and orchards all over the place. But in all of the major cities of early medieval Italy, there were veg patches, dedicated allotments, and vineyards and olive groves and fruit orchards. And I found this remarkable for two reasons. One, there were not food-producing gardens in the cities of the Roman Empire, at least not in the imperial period. Food was grown on rural estates called villas and very large latifunda, and the produce was brought into cities and sold at market. So if you lived in a city, you went shopping at the market and bought your cabbages and went home. And so I was really curious about where this habit of urban gardening should come from. Why did people reconfigure their homes and their cities to include veg patches and allotments? And the second reason that's really, this made me stop and think is because the cities of Italy in the early Middle Ages are the biggest, most dynamic, and most powerful certainly in the Western medieval world. Baghdad is very big from the 8th century. Constantinople is certainly thriving. But if we look at the territories of the Roman Empire, and certainly the Western Roman Empire, Italy is the most densely urbanized, and these are the largest and wealthiest cities. So if these cities have gardens in them, this is not simply a story of subsistence level dark age economy, of people finding ways to get by planting some things in their behind their house. Scholars had argued just such a thing in the past, that food cultivation in cities was a clear sign of just how bad things had got after the end of the Roman Empire. Just how far the early medieval city had gone downhill after the end of empire. In some ways, the debate around that, around those arguments, is behind us. It was a big, big conversation in the 1990s, which pointed out just how different the assumptions that historians who read texts have about cities compared to archaeologists who are dealing with material culture. And it also pointed out, I think really interestingly, how different Anglophone, specifically English medievalists, approached this problem when compared to Italians. English medievalists tend to be rather more positive about a timber-framed thatched cottage with a garden attached to it than Italians. And most Italian archaeologists and historians are living in major cities with limestone paved streets and not a lot of cultivated spaces. But I'm not really interested in these the sort of squabbles around continuity or rupture, which is how these debates settled out, or whether gardens are good or bad. I'm more interested in interrogating gardens as something that needs to be explained. If they weren't part of Roman cities and they became ubiquitous in major early medieval cities, how and why did they get there? Were they core to urban economies or marginal? Were they valued and prestigious, or were they peripheral or even negatively perceived? So my research operates between history and archaeology. So I work with both documents that were written in the Middle Ages and excavated material that dates from the Middle Ages. And I could find gardens in both. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the things that I've found, and then give you a sense of why I think we need to revise our understanding of this period, literally from the ground up. So from the Latin-speaking parts of Europe, we have literally thousands of property documents. Some are on papyrus, some are on parchment. They were recorded by professional scribes or notaries who used formulas for conventional documents. If I were to try to write a history of modern British cities on the basis of land registry documents, it would probably be pretty dry reading. But that's definitely not the case for the early Middle Ages, at least I don't think so. Because these documents, while they follow formulas, have really quite a lot of detail about people, about where properties are located, about what they include, where they are in cities, and the relationships between the people in the transaction. So we can see families, we can see their strategies for preserving their land, we can see people's professions and their relationships with churches, and we can see the reuse of the material fabric of cities. So I'm giving you an example here on the screen from Lucca. So Lucca is a really quite small city in Tuscany. This is a document of 738. This is an original parchment of the 8th century. But it very explicitly says it's a copy made in the 8th century of this agreement that happened in 738. Auripert, the cleric, sold to Jordanus, a priest, a house with a garden, and then it's signed by witnesses. But you can also see that in the little excerpt of the translation that I've given you on the side, you can see that it describes the boundaries of the property, the neighbors, Berucionis Belongonis and Mamarianus, who has a garden nearby. And then you can see at the bottom, and you can see where it's copied here, the sign of the hand of the individuals. Auripert, the cleric, who's the owner, Carus, Casualdus, Alipert, several others, and then Ricky Brandis, who's the person who wrote the document. And I can show you here a map of early medieval Lucca. Here's the Church of San Giorgio, where the property is located, inside the boundary of the Roman city walls. And here's how those property documents are kept in the ecclesiastical archives at Lucca. So let me give you another example. This one's from Rome. And here I'm just giving you my English translation of the transcription of the document. So here we are 250 years later in the 10th century in Rome. And this is a rental agreement for a priest who is renting from a church a house with 2 stories and roof tiles, a pergola, a marble staircase, and a garden that has olive trees or other fruiting trees. And we can see where it is. It's in the center of town near the Colosseum, and we can see the boundaries. And we can see that he's renting a parcel of land that's adjoined with artisans, so a smith and a bronze worker, the garden of Constantinus, who's a priest, and his associates, and Anna, most noble girl. And here I'll show you, this is a Google Earth view of Rome now. And here's the precinct of the temple of Romulus of Venus and Rome, which is called the Romuleum in the document. And this is the church, Santa Maria Nova, that's renting out this parcel of land, which is located somewhere here on this precinct. We can see gardens in archaeology as well. So I'm going to give you an example here from Naples. Now, archaeologists have long known that Roman houses were subdivided in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. So here we've got an insula, so a large multifamily house or apartment building that goes over 2 floors and is subdivided into 2 dwellings, which have a sort of suite of rooms opening onto an earthen terrace. Right, and here's the other suite of rooms opening onto this earthen terrace in the ground floor level. The areas that are not used in this building are filled with earth, with what the archaeologists have called dark earth, which has a lot of charcoal and organic material in it. We used to think that dark earth was something that accumulated over when a place was abandoned. But new techniques, the micromorphology of the geological analysis of dark earth, allows us to see that it's a lot more than that. So here we are in Florence. You can see the walls of the Roman city there, and we're in the sort of expanded medieval bit between the Arno and the Florence. And we're actually in the car park of the Uffizi Gallery, where a trench has produced a lot of quite interesting stuff, but also a very good sample of dark earth that has been analyzed in thin section to reveal its organic compounds. And what we can see is that this dark earth is not at all accumulated over time. It's actually very deliberately deposited with manure, with ash from hearths and from kitchen hearths and from fires, and with kitchen waste. So it's compost, really, of, in this case, the 8th century. So when we think about, I got one more example. Sometimes we're really lucky, and we can also see what people have actually planted. So here we are. This is an artist's reconstruction of a site in Rome at the Forum of Caesar, with gardens of 2 phases from the 9th century, where we've actually got the planting holes and the root balls of plants and the seeds from plantings. So in the first phase, in the early 9th century, we've got yellow plum, cherry, fig, and a sort of green bit that has celery, coriander, and other sort of cabbages. And then that's covered over with a layer of dark earth and planted with vineyards, between which there are rows of vegetables. So we've got a lot of gardens in all of these different kinds of cities up and down the Italian peninsula. I haven't shown them all to you here, but we can see gardens that are owned by kings, by bishops, as well as all the way down the sort of social order of property owners in the early Middle Ages. Smiths, artisans, widows, Anna, the most noble girl, whoever she was. In the 10th century in Europe, people start to take surnames, and they are usually based on their professions. And we have very, very few people who take surnames around gardening. Ortulanus would be the normal one. And we have very few examples of that, which corresponds to a broader picture that we have, that there's very little professional gardening in early medieval Italy. We have people who have gardens and they work them themselves for their own household use. We can see people in the property documents hang on to their garden spaces. So sometimes families will donate their property to a church, to their neighborhood church, while preserving the use for their lifetime or their children's lifetime, as a way of making sure that the property stays intact and stays out of the hands of the not so nice cousins or any eventual stepchildren that might happen in the family. And some of these are very large-scale gardens. Some of them are very small. Sometimes the dimensions are specified in the documents. But the fact that houses are described with gardens in the documents indicates that the concept of townhouse had changed in the early Middle Ages. So the domus of antiquity may have had an atrium, and it may have even been planted with some ornamental plants, but none of this was food producing. In the early Middle Ages, by contrast, we've got food producing places and absolutely no evidence of ornamental gardens. Economic decline and the breakdown of the Roman state-sponsored marketing of goods across the Mediterranean, the breakdown of this certainly had something to do with why people built gardens, right? They needed to be able to grow cabbages and onions and garlic because they needed food to eat. The other factor that played a role, I think, is Christianity. And this happened at two levels. One is that very early Christians distinguished themselves from their non-Christian counterparts as people who did not like flowers. So early Christians had or wrote about a distaste for the garlands of flowers and the crowns of flowers that were traditionally used in temples and to celebrate festivals in antiquity. So already in the 2nd century, we've got Christian authors who are criticizing the luxuries of flowers and aligning roses and their thorns with Christ's suffering against traditional celebrations. This sentiment continues in the early Middle Ages. Wildflowers are valued and praised, like Matthew's Gospel celebrates the lilies of the field as a sort of allegory for Christians, but not ornamental flowers. The Christian metaphors for gardens, for the Virgin as an enclosed garden, that all comes much later in the Middle Ages. It's not part of the worldview of people and their landscapes in the early Middle Ages. There were positive cultural associations of gardens, and these came from ideas of efficient management of estates and proper stewardship of land. And those are very ancient ideas that were transmitted to the Middle Ages through classical texts like Virgil and Varro and late agronomists like Palladius. And this relates to the second aspect of how Christianity shaped these gardens. The economic and political changes that happened around the end of the Roman Empire meant that households took on a much more significant role in society. And churches, religious institutions, styled themselves as households. And the laity interacted with these institutions in something that was conceptually akin to a household. So the gardens allow us to see those relationships. What's at stake in this research, and what I hope to have been able to show you, and what I am publishing in book form starting in January, or coming out in January, is that when we integrate material and textual evidence, we get a much fuller picture. The reason that we study early medieval history is because we've got problematic evidence, and we want to understand what happens, and it's challenging. So we have a much stronger impetus to try and understand how we know what we know, and it's the integration of text and archaeology that facilitates this. The other thing that I think is really key about doing this is that the environment has been for too long ignored as a source of understanding social, economic, and political change. And it's by thinking about gardens and wider landscapes that we can actually see people in the cities of early medieval Europe. Thank you. Now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to James.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Hello, my name is James Dolan. I'm a junior research fellow in science communication here at King's. You can tell I'm a junior research fellow because I can touch the other side of my office from my chair. I was once an engineer, then something more of a physicist, a nanotechnologist, and I'm now a monstrous hybrid of a physical scientist and wannabe social scientist. I've made this uncomfortable and disquieting foray into social science because I'm interested in science communication, the way scientists talk to and with, or perhaps at and over, non-scientists. In particular, I'm interested in communication between scientists and policymakers, in how scientists and policymakers' different conceptions of science affect their communication behavior. In other words, whether scientists and policymakers' ideas of what science is, how science works, and what science is for are connected in any way with the form and content of their interactions. Now, science communication is something that scientists often do, but it's something that social scientists study. So to engage in evidence-based, or perhaps rather evidence-informed science communication, is to learn from and contribute to an entirely separate field of academic endeavour from my erstwhile home disciplines. However, I'll not be talking to you about this particular interest because for perhaps the first and last time in our lives, we might be a bit fed up with talk of the communication or supposed lack thereof between scientists and policymakers. Instead, I would like to talk to you about something far more fun, perhaps even funny: improvised comedy. Before coming to King's, I was a postdoc at the University of Chicago, where I tried very hard to make something called self-assembled optical metasurfaces. The self-assembly bit meaning that if I did my job right, the thing would ideally just make itself. Alongside the bashing of one's head against the metaphorical brick wall that is experimental nanophotonics research, I began studying improvised comedy, or improv, at the Revival Theatre in Hyde Park, Chicago. If you're not familiar with improv, it's a form of spontaneous theatre, often but not always comedic, where ensemble members perform various games and forms on stage, or 2020 being what it is, over the dreaded Zoom. And these games and forms might last anywhere between a couple of minutes up to an hour. Although the structure of a form might be predefined and well rehearsed, the content is, as the name suggests, entirely improvised, with inspiration for content often being solicited from audience members. Hour-long improvised plays with a coherent narrative and a rich, unique cast of characters can arise from only a single word suggestion from the audience. Improv comedy is one of the many arts explored by the field of improvisation studies alongside, for example, improvised music, theatre, literature, film, and dance. My interest in improv arose from and through an interest in science communication. I was on the lookout for particularly performative forms of science communication and heard about the Revival Theatre's recent efforts to use improv to help scientists communicate and collaborate more effectively. The Revival wasn't the first to do this. That honour probably goes to the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University in New York. And the Second City Theatre in Chicago has for decades been a proponent of what the literature calls applied improv in corporate settings. But the Revival was the first that I came across, and the owners were open to collaboration. While studying improv myself, I worked with the theatre to better understand how and why the skills developed through improv were applicable to science and science communication, and began to explore how improv could be used for public engagement through the creation of Chicago's first science improv show, The Excited State, which is a physics joke, a very funny physics joke. So here's what we determined and what therefore underpins my research exploring improv as a science and science communication training tool. Learning and practicing improv leads improvisers to develop three key skills. The first, implementation of the concept of yes and. The second, improved empathy. And the third, effective storytelling. The concept of yes and itself encompasses a range of overlapping and closely connected skills, including active listening, acceptance of others' ideas, and reciprocation with one's own ideas. It is these skills, and in particular the values they demonstrate, which make improv a particularly intriguing form of outreach and public engagement, and which impact upon individual practitioners and team members alike. Taking those aforementioned skills in turn, number one, yes and. The concept of yes and is fundamental to improv. It encapsulates the necessity of accepting another's ideas, that's the yes bit, and then building upon them in your own contribution, that's the and bit. It is in the medical improv literature sometimes referred to as attunement, affirmation, and advancement. Clearly, in order to accept another's ideas, it's first necessary to hear them, hence the first incorporated skill of active listening. This refers to the process of actively paying attention to, anticipating, and assimilating what a communication partner wishes to communicate, whether verbally or non-verbally. We listen for the reason that we fully intend to modulate what we then say or do in response to what we have just heard or observed, to accept the idea offered us. Anything less betrays a lack of respect either for our partner or their ideas or worldview. By listening, we make clear that our partner is worth listening to. Finally, we reciprocate and offer in return a thought or action which builds upon the ideas offered to us. Although born in very different contexts, the concept of yes and clearly demonstrates the values underpinning the shift from deficit to dialogue in UK science communication. Indeed, much of the language used in improv is mirrored in that used to justify more participatory forms of democracy and public deliberation, which is perhaps not surprising given that both are firmly rooted in respect for one's communication partner. Now, the second skill, empathy. Through the character work and role play inherent in most improv, we are forced to empathize with those who think, feel, and act differently to ourselves. These characters and those we interact with have different worldviews, inhabit different realities, and are driven by different motivations. We must therefore improve our ability to empathize in order to practice and perform improv. An ability to critically reflect upon our own worldview and to empathize with that of others, again, underpins the turn to dialogue in UK science communication, as well as the increased emphasis on responsible research and innovation in the European research community. And third and finally, storytelling. Through scene work, improvisers become storytellers and begin to learn the most compelling and successful narratives. An active consideration of storytelling belies a care for and understanding of the audience's experience of improv. The audience is always present, complicating the context in which other decisions are made. Storytelling and narrative forms of communication are increasingly recognized as particularly powerful communication tools. So those are the skills, but what of the effect on scientists? Practicing and performing improv often has the direct effect of increasing an individual's confidence, especially when asked to undertake challenging intellectual tasks in front of others. Science and science communication are full of tasks like this. Think public speaking and presenting, fielding questions at a conference or in an interview, teaching unruly and unreasonably intelligent undergraduates, and so on. This increased confidence can help to quell nerves and mitigate the fear of failure, which might otherwise get in the way of effective communication. Furthermore, even if your communication partner does not reciprocate, the deployment of yes and can improve interactions. For example, by ensuring that you are and are seen to be responsive to their perspectives and opinions. Think interactions between scientists and public stakeholders when it comes to controversial technologies. Additionally, the use of effective storytelling strategies can help ensure that individual communication outputs, presentations, reports, papers, and so on, are compelling from an audience's perspective. Yet more significant impacts can be anticipated at the community level, at the level of the team or the group, if a critical mass of members develop and utilize the above skills. Mutual respect is naturally engendered through improv, nurtured through playful and supportive contexts, through improv-based forms, constantly demonstrating the acceptance that is inherent in yes and. As respect is developed, so is trust. Trust that the others will listen to, value, and build upon your contributions. The most exciting collaborations are about creating ideas and projects which are more than the sum of their parts. They're about generating and realizing scientific ideas which neither of you could have envisaged alone, for which yes and provides a useful framework. Together, mutual respect and trust, along with improved confidence, further mitigates this fear of failure, which often manifests as a fear of appearing stupid, getting something wrong, not understanding, and so on. The last thing a scientist wants to do is to look stupid, but that same fear of looking stupid is what holds us back from expressing our ideas to one another. Underpinning these impacts is the understanding that science is a human endeavor. We want to work with those we respect and trust. Scientists as humans are necessarily fallible, but if we're too scared of failing, we'll never take the intellectual risks needed to progress. And a supportive and collegial environment provides that psychological safety net for scientists to think creatively without fear of failure. Everything I've just told you is, to some extent, a hypothesis. It's what I believe to be the case and is broadly analogous to that which those in the medical improv community, which is the application of improv to improve patient-doctor communications, what those in the medical improv community also believe. However, it's a hypothesis which can be tested, and it is testing this hypothesis, exploring what happens to scientists when they are trained in improv, that will take up some of my time as a junior research fellow over the next few years. Thankfully, no matter what the answer to these questions turns out to be, I know that it will be great fun trying to answer them. Thank you very much, and back over to Nick.
Thank you very much indeed, James, and also thanks to Caroline and to Jason. Of course, what James has been too polite to point out is the fact that being a fellow of King's involves skills in improvised comedy, almost sort of 24/7, but we'll pass quickly over that. Can I just remind you that there's still space and time for you to ask any questions. Just click on the Q&A option at the bottom of your screens and write to us. A few have come in, and I'll try to ensure equity by moving cyclically through our three speakers. So if I could go to Jason first. We've been asked, you mentioned various ways in which the financial systems are not working to keep criminal money out of things. If they're not working as well as they should, how can the situation be improved?
Thanks very much, Nick. I think often there's at least an impulse that I find strange from policymakers to say, well, we have a law, it's not working very well, let's pass another law and hope that second time lucky. That there is the idea of kind of layering successive regulations or rules or treaties on top of each other. And I think a fairly basic but underappreciated insight is that rules don't enforce themselves. And in fact, a lot more effort is required in terms of auditing and checking that people are doing the things they're meant to be doing, and indeed giving an incentive for banks to do the right thing, or at least a bigger disincentive to stop them doing the wrong thing. I think outside of the United States, banking regulators and governments in places like Britain and Western Europe have been surprisingly shy in really penalising banks when they are either actively complicit in criminal activity or when they're kind of negligent or reckless as well. So I think it needs a much more robust approach, and dare I say, a bit of mystery shopping on behalf of regulators might not go astray either. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions coming for Caroline. Caroline, can any changes in Italian garden use be discerned as a result of the migrations of the Ostrogoths, Lombards, and other non-Italian groups during the decline of the Western Empire?
That's a great question. I love that question. The answer is maybe. One of the ways in which people have tried to explore that is to look at changes in cereal production. So focusing less on what people are growing in cities, because the sort of standard basket of things that people grow in city gardens is more or less the same: cabbages, onions, garlic, celery, brassicas, so different kinds of cabbage, kale, broccoli, that sort of thing, and then aromatics, carrots, and that sort of stuff. But what changes quite a lot in late antiquity in Italy is grains. So you get the reintroduction of rye, which is something that didn't grow very much in the Roman period. The Roman cereal par excellence was bread wheat. So you get changes in cereal production, which may have something to do with people coming into the Italian peninsula, bringing their crops or their tastes for certain kinds of bread with them. But we can't say it's just that. We have to say that there's also efforts that people are putting in place to mitigate risk in their agricultural production, so that bread wheat, if you've got a bad year, can have a really, really, really poor outcome that decimates your chance of having bread or pancakes for the rest of the year. Whereas if you plant a diversity of different grains, then you mitigate your risk somewhat. And that is certainly happening in late antiquity, whether it's done by so-called barbarians or not. Although I will say, quite interestingly, the Italian expression for a kind of mixed cereal production is the produzione barbarico. So it's sort of recognized as or it's perceived, at least in modern Italy, as something that the barbarians brought into the Italian peninsula.
Oh. Thank you. Well, thank you for the answer. Thank you too for the question. We come to James then, and we're asked whether it will be possible to test whether the recipients of the science communication have a better understanding when the improv techniques are used.
Thanks ever so much for the question. What that highlights is, a really important point to make. You'll notice as I went through my talk, I was talking about the effect upon scientists. Improv is a terrible medium for communicating science content because you're meant to be making things up as you go, so you can't guarantee the accuracy of any content. So there are two answers to the question. The first is to say, yes, it might be possible to explore whether or not scientists trained in improv techniques, not necessarily deploying it, but having been trained in those techniques, might be more effective science communicators. And then the second is to say that actually improv might be a wonderful way of exploring, for example, the nature of science or how science works with an audience without necessarily trying to communicate some science content. The thing I'll just add to this is that we always have to be a little bit careful that although the idea of scientific literacy has some general currency, it's not actually that simple to think about scientific literacy once you kind of begin to think at any length about what it means to understand some science. Is it enough to know science facts? Do you have to know about process? Does it matter the context in which you understand that? So definitely it's not easy to do, but I think there would be potential in certain contexts emphatically to test this.
Thanks. We've got about 5 minutes left. We've got to keep an eye on the time, but there is time for more. So I'll come back to Jason. Jason, an ethical question, I suppose. If your research throws up criminal wrongdoing, do you inform the police?
You'd be surprised what people are willing to put in writing to a stranger in an email. So we have had some responses that said, "Oh, you look like a terrorist financier. We'll have to charge you more to do business." And that sort of does lead to the question of, well, can and should we report this to law enforcement authorities? It's obviously a disquieting finding. But according to university ethics rules, the answer is no, we don't, and in fact can't report this because as part of the quid pro quo for being able to use deception in our experiments, after all, they're based on impersonating fictitious people, that no living, breathing people, or indeed no companies, can come to harm as a result of our research. So we in fact anonymize and destroy the names of the people and the companies in such a way as we can't be forced to reveal them, even if we were subpoenaed or even if we were subject to a civil lawsuit. So in fact, we communicate the results by physically posting USB sticks through the mail to each other so that we don't have copies running around on email like that. So no, we don't report this sort of thing to the police. We're interested in overall patterns of what works and what doesn't work rather than catching individual villains.
Thanks very much. Caroline, another one for you. Is there going hand in hand with this development of sort of kitchen gardens and allotments and so on, a literature on cookery? Is there, you know, who's the medieval Elizabeth David, as it were?
So that's another really interesting question. The answer is no, that there aren't a lot of recipe books in Latin. We get some sort of ancient, Apicius is one that gets recopied into the Middle Ages, but there's not the production of new ones until we get to the later Middle Ages, and then they tend to be written in vernacular languages. So in Provençal, we get some. There are Arabic cookery books of this period. So some of them might have been circulating in the Muslim parts of Italy, but not so much. We get medical recipe books. So we get ingredient lists for medicines, which specify what seeds, what plants need to be added and cures they could bring about. So there's new recipe writing in text, but no, Elizabeth David, I'm afraid not.
Okay, thanks. And there's a medical angle to this last question to James. You were talking about medical improv. Can you say anything about how that has actually been used in a medical context?
I'll just mention very briefly that it's one of the particular areas where improv has been explored in an educational context, because that patient-doctor or patient-clinician relationship hinges very delicately on the kind of, the verbal and non-verbal cues which you offer to and receive from one another. Every interaction is different, and you really have to, in order to come up with a care plan, you really have to be attuned to the entirety of the person who's opposite you. So, it's not a particularly effective patient-clinician relationship if a particular prognosis, is delivered in an unempathetic way, or if a particular treatment plan is sort of offered without having come about from a dialogue between the two. And so emphatically for medical students, particularly in the US, you'll see it used more as part of early communication training.
Thanks very much. Well, there are other questions I could pose, but we're hard up against the end of the hour, so I'm afraid I think I need to wrap this up here. And simply to say, once again, thanks to all three of our speakers for being so clear and sticking to time. special thanks again to Caroline for stepping in at the last moment and filling a space. Thank you to all of you who have, out of sight but not out of mind, been the audience and the participants in this hour session on current research. I hope you've gained something from it and that you're also enjoying other parts of the virtual program that we put together for you during this week. But most of all, of course, we all hope that it won't be too much longer before we can see you back in college again and re-establish real alumni relations. So with that, thank you all very much and all very best wishes and goodbye.